Good morning, everyone. Welcome to your third Coffee with Miss Cook for the class of 2026. This morning, it is the extended remix edition with extra people to have coffee with as well. I'm on to some orange juice, but wherever you're at, welcome. And as always, a couple of housekeeping items. Please stay on mute for the duration of this coffee because we've got our guests. We're going to do a little panel conversation with them, and then we should have time for questions. And I'll just ask that you put those in the chat so that we keep things sort of controlled. And our agenda this morning, as always, I have a little bit of content, a couple of reminders for you up top, and then we'll have our panel of delightful college reps, and then some Q&A. We are recording. I'll distribute to everyone later in the week when it's available. And as always, this is meant to be an hour-long program. So whether you've still got questions or not, we're going to stop at 9. And you can always email me later if things are percolating in your brain from our conversation that you'd like some answers to. So a couple just quick words from me, reminders. I'm sure there's some buzz in your house as students have gotten home from their journeys. I heard that the New Orleans trip was great for the junior class, so I hope you have heard that as well. And I know we've got 2.5 weeks here of school, and then we're off for Pesach break. So just to give you a little bit of a preview, when we come back from Pesach, things are really going to be rolling with college advising. Gird your loins here and get ready for that. After Pesach break, starting on the 22nd of April, which is our first day back at school, I will start having my final appointments with students for the end of junior year. And I'll send them a sign-up sheet at the end of break to start signing up for those. It's our last formal check-in, but of course they can make other appointments with me. We're going to talk about those recommendation letters and what faculty to ask for those. We're going to check in on their list. If they don't have a list, we're going to nudge them on the list. We'll check in on testing and just to make sure that we've touched base on things before we head into the summer. I'll also remind you that our case studies program is April 27th at USF. It's Sunday afternoon from around 2 to 5, half mock admission committee, half college fair. There will be 100 some college reps there. And I think that I just got some data on this, and the formal invitation, so you can see all the details, I should be pushing out to you next week. So that's where you RSVP and whatnot. Also, after Pesach break, we'll launch that college essay unit in English classes. There will be a second questionnaire for students to do for me at some point in May, and we will have our last Coffee with Miss Cook on Monday, May 5th. So a lot of stuff happening going into the summer. Keep an eye on your email for information on those. And remember that while we will have lots of things happening in April and May, I work all summer. I will take some vacation, but I will have some Zoom appointments on my calendar. We can keep the conversation going. The end of the school year is not like a hard stop on this conversation, but there are some things we need to get in before faculty are off for the summer. Okay, so I will pause there on reminders, and now we're going to enjoy some conversation with our special guests this morning. I am so delighted to have Grant and Gary and Laura with us. They represent colleges that are popular with JCHS families. We have kids on all of their campuses that are happy. We have admitted students, which I'm always so excited to say, on all of their campuses, where we've only got 47 kids in the senior class. They have definitely done good work. And they represent a range of types of institutions that students can choose from small, medium to large, public, private, women's college. So there is a method to my madness here in terms of having you hear from some different types of places as well. But most importantly, they are top-notch ethical professionals who have long and storied careers in college admissions. So we're really lucky to have them this morning. And I'd love, so I don't do any of you a disservice, if we could go around and each of you just briefly introduce yourselves to just tell us who you are and where you are, and if there's anything relevant about where you've been before your current institutions. So I'm going to go alphabetically and start with Mr. Gary Clark.
Good morning, Lauren. Good morning to all the families on the call this morning. My name is Gary Clark. I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor for Enrollment Management at UCLA. I've been on this campus for going on 13 years. For about 10 of those years, I was the Director of Undergraduate Admission before stepping into this role, which oversees our work in the areas of admission, financial aid, and some of our outreach efforts. overall a career of, about 27 years or so at a handful of different institutions. Started at College of William and Mary back in Virginia, was in Claremont, where Laura sits right now, for a number of years at Pitzer College, and then at USC of all places before coming over to UCLA about 13 years ago. So seeing the world of admissions through a handful of different lenses, but happy to be here with you all and look forward to the questions.
Grant.
Also, thank you all for having me, and I will be at that Case Cities event at the end of April, so hope to see you all in person as well. But my name is Grant Preheim, Associate Director of Admission with the University of Denver. That's my 4th year with DU, and I cover our Northern California, Oregon, and Washington territories. Prior to my time there, I lived in Los Angeles, California, and worked regionally for the University of Oregon. And prior to that, I worked at the University of Kansas, but this is my 8th year in college admissions overall. So happy to be here.
Thank you. And Miss Stratton.
Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see you all. My name is Laura. I'm the Director of Admission at Scripps College down in Claremont. Have been at Claremont for about 18 years, 17 of those as director. Prior to that was at my alma mater, the University of Redlands, for a few years, and then a small non-selective Lutheran college prior to that. So have bopped around, but all on the private side after doing graduate work at UCLA. So super happy to be here.
Excellent. So I've got a couple of general questions that I'm going to launch out to everyone. You all don't have to answer every single one, but if you've got something to say, please let us know. But right now we've got juniors trying to build their application list, right? And trying to research colleges and understand what their preferences are and all the rest. So do you have any advice you would give to a junior as they begin this research, either how to do it or where to do it or things to consider? Anyone can jump in.
I'll start. I told Lauren this on text this morning. I am fueled this morning by coffee and cold medicine. So, that's always a good combination to start the day. So I think there are just a few things I would keep in mind when you're thinking about the list with your student. The first is rather than thinking first and foremost about what the colleges want from your student, having the student reflect on who they are before they started this process and as they're in this process. And so just prompting them with questions about how they learn best, the types of environments where they're the most, I think, sort of happy, but also challenged, and just for them to do some self-reflection, I think is the first thing. And then the second one is to perhaps be open to surprise. You have a wonderful college counselor who's walking you through this process and helping. And, Ms. Cook might put some schools on the list and you're like, what, why that one? But I think there's this wonderful opportunity, especially for your students, but even for you as family members, to be surprised by the schools that end up resonating with your students. So I think those are just two very high level pieces of advice that I think can be helpful, particularly for parents.
Yeah, I guess I would build on that and just say I agree with Laura, but I think that from a practical standpoint, what I encourage families to do is to really take advantage of a lot of the opportunities to engage with colleges and universities virtually. I think, I've said before, one of the very thin silver linings of the pandemic is that colleges and universities really had to kind of up their virtual game, because there was a period where the only way to interact or visit was virtually at a lot of places. And so I think when, if and when, Ms. Cook put some of those schools on your list and you're like, oh, I don't know, I haven't heard of that, or I don't know much about it. You don't necessarily have to get on a plane to go check it out. You may ultimately decide to do that, and I think that's a great idea. But initially there are a lot of ways to take kind of very, very kind of live tours of campuses, even sit in on some classes on occasion, hear admission presentations, and really get to know a place without necessarily having to jump on a plane and go visit in person. So it's a good place to start. And when those places that are not on the tip of your tongue, or places that well, start to resonate, it's a great way to get to know some of those places a little bit better.
Okay, well, as experienced admission professionals, I would love to know, and this is a broad question, but what are some of the things you consider in applications? And is there a most important piece, something that students or parents should really be thinking about focusing on as they're preparing things for the fall?
Yeah, I think what's cool about this panel is that we have 3 schools that also have very different admission standards and acceptance rates. So I think all of us are gonna have very different answers to this question. You know, for us, we're about a 65% acceptance rate. So we spend a lot of our time on the academic side of your students' transcripts, you know, their strength of schedule, their GPAs that are listed, their grade trends. And then from there, if we do have any question marks or there were any extenuating circumstances, then I think we look for overall context after that. But for us, we spend a lot of our time dissecting that transcript, making sure that students are going to be academically successful regardless of what they want to study. And then we look for context outside of that. We are a school that's been TIS optional since 2019, so before the pandemic. So I think that shifted a lot of how we review, and we did a very timely time with the pandemic a year after.
I think the other important thing, I agree with Grant, that the question that we ask ourselves when we're reviewing applications at Scripps is, can the student be academically successful at Scripps? And because of the self-selecting nature of our applicant pool, that's most students. But what is most helpful is not only are we getting the transcript from Ms. Cook, but we're also getting something called a school profile. So that school profile is really helpful because it gives us an idea of what's available at any particular high school. So we obviously want to look at a student's academic performance within the context of what's available to them. And also just, are there any curricular or academic programs that are unique to your school, right? So that's our job to know that. And it's our job to have those conversations with Ms. Cook so that we're making sure that we're looking at that within the context of what's available. So one of the questions is sometimes, well, what if we don't have as many APs as Lowell High School? Well, yeah, then you're not going to take as many APs, right? And that's fine. It's our job to know those things and to put it within the context of what's available. The other thing that we've been talking a lot about at Scripps recently is alignment with our mission. And so taking the pillars of our mission and really looking for those in what a student chooses to write about, what the recommenders write about, how a student spends their time outside of school. And so rather than a student feeling like they have to fit into what we're looking for, the student is telling us things about themselves through an interview or their personal essay. And then we're like, well, this is who we are. We can look for that alignment. And that really is, I think, where the magic happens in terms of what we're looking for. So there's no magic answer. But I do think that we are looking, particularly after the pandemic, for students who are looking to be actively engaged in an in-person residential experience. This is not something that, we are not an online place. And so I think it is also for students to be able to articulate how they see themselves engaging in college.
Yeah, I'd build on 2 words that you heard, both Grant and Laura talk about, and that is kind of context and kind of academics. I think the perspective I would come at this from is talking from the space of a highly selective institution. And I say it because I think you all need to hear this and students need to understand this, that when you're looking at highly selective colleges and universities, which, to be clear, are not normal. Okay, the vast majority of colleges and universities out there are phenomenal institutions that are not highly selective and don't operate necessarily in the way that I'm about to describe as it relates to just how selective it is. We are looking at context. Context matters a great deal. We do not look at things in a vacuum. And I think especially with UC, sometimes there's this perception that, the students that are at schools where they have these gaudy weighted GPAs that, are close to 5.0, if I'm not at a school like that, I'm going to be at a disadvantage. And that is absolutely not the case. There are schools where that 4.7 weighted GPA will put you in the 3rd decile of the graduating class, so, it's, I always say a 3.8 is not a 3.8, it's not a 3.8. A 3.8 in one school and one curriculum can mean something very different than a 3.8 in a different school, in a different curriculum. But the last quick thing I want to say is building on something that Laura said, and that is the self-selective nature of the applicant pool. When you're in a highly selective admission space, what we're looking at is very similar to what you've heard already. What we're looking at isn't that different amongst us. How we're looking at it and what makes something competitive is different in each of our spaces. Because it's when you talk about students who are performing at a high level, who've done very well academically, who've achieved things outside of class, who are leaders and doing all the things that we would want to see in a highly selective process. The challenging fact that we face is we have tens of thousands of students who meet all of those descriptions. that are excelling, that are doing well, and that's who you're competing against. So it's not just the volume of applications, which is what gets a lot of headlines, especially as it relates to my campus, but it's the self-selective nature of the applicant pool that makes the process as competitive as it is. So I think just focusing on, you know, doing good work, doing the things that students love to do because they love to do them, like that's what's going to help a student stand out in any process, but especially in the highly selective space.
Amazing. Thank you for those answers. That was really helpful and a good range of ways in which things are viewed. So there's a lot of talk about academics and GPA and all of that. What is the role of extracurriculars in the process? And I'm also thinking about summer with that. I've been getting a lot of emails in the past week about various summer things. And is this looking better than that? And, you know, what there's this trying to guess what you all are looking for. And so I'm curious about the role of extracurriculars and how much, whether there needs to be diversity or specific kinds you're looking for or whatnot.
I guess I'll.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, it is. We always do this. We're doing so good. We're doing so good. No, but I think quickly the thing that I think we care about most deeply is, you know, we ask about what students do outside of class, not because we're just trying to be additive and we want to consider more things. Like as Laura kind of talked about before, when we're trying to build a campus, an incoming class, we're really thinking about who are the students that are going to contribute to the community both in and outside of the classroom. Like you're not just a student sitting in class, like that is a fundamental foundational part of the experience, but you are also a student living in the residence halls. You're engaged in the experience outside of class. And so we want to see that students are active and engaged both in and outside of the classroom. We're looking for that kind of evidence, you know, in their application. But what they're doing outside of class, I think for me, comes in all kinds of shapes and sizes. You know, maybe it's school related, maybe it's a club on campus, maybe it's athletics, maybe it's, you know, the school newspaper, you know, whatever the case may be. But maybe you take care of a family member at home. Maybe you work part-time. Maybe you're active in a faith-based community. You know, whatever it is, like I don't think we put a premium on one thing over another. I think we just want to see that students are engaged in something that's meaningful to them. You know, think less about what it is that you think we're looking for and focus more on doing the things that are really exciting for the student, you know, to be engaged in. That's what's really going to leap off the page is that sense of I'm doing this because it's meaningful to me. And I always tell students it's not the length of the resume that matters. It's the depth of commitment to the things that you do that really stands out to us. So rather than thinking I've got to check all these boxes because I know colleges are looking for all of these things, you know, discover the things that you enjoy doing, and sometimes you discover things you don't enjoy doing, and that's not a bad use of your time either. So I didn't mention anything about summer, but I've already been talking too long, so I'll let Grant or Laura kind of round that out.
Yeah, I can touch on that. One thing I love that Gary mentioned is just kind of this quality over quantity. I think sometimes we see students that want to fill up all 10 spaces because we give all 10 spaces to the common application or additional applications. But, you know, doing something for 1 week over the summer, like a beach cleanup, is very different from someone who's involved with something every week for 52 weeks out of the year, who maybe has a leadership opportunity. So, yeah, I think for us, we look a lot at quality over quantity. Summer can be tricky. I mean, you'll see some students, especially from the Bay Area, who are doing research at Stanford, or they are, you know, going on these massive trips to do help build homes or something like that. But summer, I think for us, we look a lot more at what's happening in that school year. You know, how are students also able to manage that work-life balance of academics and their extracurriculars or their part-time job or helping at home. We also recognize that summer's your time to recoup, and sometimes it's your time to mentally reset before your senior year, which flies by but is exhausting. So I would say we wouldn't put any more weight on what's happening this summer, just more to kind of Gary's point. We want to see that you're actually invested in things that are getting you excited, or maybe you realize you did it once and you never have to do it again.
We've been talking in our office a lot about, and this again is somewhat of a interesting holdover from COVID, of this idea of the difference between engagement and hobbies. And I want to be very clear, I think both have their place, right? So I worry a lot in this process, particularly having children of my own, that we like kind of expect them to be robots who just like want to give, right? Give to their community, give to their temple, give to the school, and then there's no opportunity for them to take care of themselves. And the reality is that they not only need to get into college, they're going to have to go to college, right? And that is an inherently, not stressful, but it's just transitional, right? And if they've done all the giving and their cup is, there's nothing left in it by the time they get there. I think that's where we see, just from an executive functioning perspective, just some challenges. So I always think it's great when students like, I'm like living for this cat, by the way, that is on there. There's like someone who has a kitty cat who keeps coming across the screen. That's very funny to me. I love a student who talks about like love of reading, love of cooking, love of hiking, being in nature, and it doesn't need to be any particular thing, but I do think that it's helpful for us to know that a student's also going to have the skills and sort of toolbox to come to college and be a human being. And so I would just say, I mean, the summer thing, like, let it go. I mean, I think if that's something you really want to do, if that's what your kid really wants to do, fine. But like, I love a kid who's like, just hanging out and traveling and making friends, right? I mean, it's that stuff that I think is so important for us as we build a community. Now, if your student has their sights set on Ivies and places that are selecting less than 10% of their students, that's different. But those are conversations I think you can have with Ms. Cook along the way of what's the trade-off, right? In all of these decisions that you're making as a family of how you're spending your time. So that's my parental soapbox, probably as much as my admission soapbox.
I love your soapbox. Thank you. I do try and repeat that let's at least take a week or two to just fill the bucket during summer. Summer is, in theory, supposed to be for some rest.
Yeah.
Okay, from that lovely social emotional perspective, let's do a hard pivot into test scores. I do get, as we've been talking about pieces of the application, the academics, the extracurriculars, we are in this sort of strange testing zone, and Grant had mentioned earlier on that Denver is test optional. I'd love to hear from each of you what your testing policy is. And then I always get this question of like, does it look bad if I don't submit my test scores if I am test optional? So do you have any thoughts on that quandary? So yeah. I'll just call on you. Do you want to start, Grant?
Yeah, sure. I brought it up earlier, so I can start. So as I mentioned before, we went test optional in 2019. For us, it was a very philosophical conversation. One thing about University of Denver is we're very well known for our learning accommodations for students. We have a program called our Learning Effectiveness Program that offers one-on-one support. So about 20 to 25% of our student body is seeking learning accommodations on campus. So for us, we realized that a lot of those students also maybe aren't the best test takers, or there's a lot of test anxiety. So we went test optional in 2019 to also give those students the opportunity to, put their best foot forward through a transcript or through letters of record, that context piece we talked about earlier. So over 70% of our students no longer submit test scores. And our kind of big saying is we cared more about how students did over 4 years than how they did 1 day and 4 hours. So they are welcome to submit them if they would like to, but I'll be honest, it plays very little role in our admission decision. Where it can impact students is more on the scholarship side of things. So, sometimes we see that strong 4.0 student who also has a really high test score. Chances are they're getting the same scholarship regardless. But we also see some students that are maybe, had a rough sophomore year of grades, but they are great test takers. Sometimes that can bump them up a couple of scholarships. So for us, it's more, we want to see how you did over those 4 years because it's a better predictor of how you're going to do in college. But if you feel like they reflect you, feel free to send them.
Great. Mr. Clark.
Pretty easy answer for UC. We're test free, so we don't consider SAT or ACT for any applicant for any purpose related to admission or scholarship. Full stop. To the question of like, what does the future hold? I can't predict that. There's no immediate conversations around any change in our testing policy, but I do think that it's good to obviously stay in touch with Ms. Cook on that, not just for our campus, but for any institution. There are a lot of schools that are still in kind of a pilot phase of their testing policy. So the testing policy of today at a college or university may not be the testing policy of tomorrow. I think the one little kind of inside baseball thing I'll share with you all. It's, we're about to start the baseball season. Go Dodgers. Dodgers fans, anyone? No? Okay. I forget the room I'm in. But the reality is we are often not the people that make those decisions related to the testing policy. I think there's this idea that it's the admission folks making those decisions. That would be lovely, but that is rarely the case. It is usually faculty, presidents, chancellors, and most often Board of Regents or Board of Trustees that are making those kinds of decisions. So those things sometimes can be slow to change. And I think that there's a lot of research happening right now around the impact of test optional and test-free processes. But for our purposes, I certainly hope we stay test-free and no immediate horizon changes that I see happening at UC right now.
So Scripps is also test optional and did so prior to the pandemic. So that was, again, like a more long form conversation among our board. And that decision was made, and we will remain test optional. What I think is interesting, Ms. Cook, which you brought up in your question, is when to submit testing, and is it seen as a problem if you don't? So I think that's an opportunity family members to be very strategic and have that conversation with Ms. Cook if your student chooses to test, of when you choose to submit it. Because for us, at least, if we have it, we will use it. And so if a student's like, oh, well, I don't know, like maybe I'll just throw it in there, and then if it's not great, they won't look at it. No. And the reason is that then becomes part of the data that we have to submit to various organizations, the federal government, US News and World Report, right? So all those things. So if we have the testing and a student says they want us to use it, we will use it. And that's not always to a student's benefit. So that's a good question to ask colleges. I think a good sort of, if you're a numbers person, is to look at a school's middle 50%. And if a student falls out of that range and that school is test optional, don't submit. We don't make any assumptions of why a student doesn't choose to test, particularly being in California and knowing the challenges just around getting a test time. So we don't make any assumptions about that. But we have seen, since we went test optional, our average testing has gone up because students are very selective of whether they choose to submit it. So it's definitely a needle that needs to be threaded carefully, but those are why those conversations are good ones to have with Ms. Cook.
Thank you all. That is very helpful. And yes, for those of you who have students engaged in testing now or over the summer, this is sort of step 2 after the prep and all of that. And then the next step is, okay, what are we working with, and where might it go, and where might we just hold it back? So we will work through all of those questions school by school in the fall. Okay, so I'd love to move on if we've got some advice, if there are common mistakes that any applicants make on their applications. Now that you're fresh out of reading season and reviewing everything, any themes, any foibles, any things our folks could avoid?
I guess one, excuse me, one quick thing that comes to mind for me, and I think this answers the question. I think sometimes students and families think that colleges and universities place the greatest premium on polish in an application, and sometimes there are people out there that are happy to take your money that talk about how they can help to polish a student's application. That's really not what we're after. I mean, some rough edges are okay. Like we want students, like I think the thing we value more than anything else in every part of the application is authenticity. Whether that's the things you choose to spend your time doing outside of class, whether that's what you choose to write about and how you write, in your personal insight questions or college essay. I think the premium we place is on authenticity and really hearing the student's voice come through in the application. That's what we're after. And I think especially from the UC perspective, we don't collect letters of recommendation. We don't interview students. So the only opportunity we really have to hear the student's voice and learn about the student is from the student in the application. So this idea of turning that voice over to any other person or any other thing because you think colleges are looking for this kind of hyper polished application that is just perfection. That's not what we're after. I think we're looking for something that's very real and tangible from the students. So just speak in the voice that is their authentic voice. Don't turn that over to any other person or thing.
And I love you very carefully threading that person or thing needle, Gary. I will say, as we launch the college essay unit, I've been working on visiting all of your kids' classes after PASOC break. There is a common habit of a parent or thinking you need an essay coach or something that gets in there and meddles with it. And then I have to come back to the kid or maybe you and say, this doesn't sound like a 17 or 18-year-old. And we don't need a 44-year-old's voice in this application. That's going to get it thrown in the trash bin. But the other issue, and as I've been preparing my comments, is, the use of AI now. I mean, I saw a lot of kids last year decide, especially for this English class grade, not necessarily for what they submitted to colleges, but just to get her done, throw some thoughts into generative AI and have it spit out a 4-paragraph personal essay. And there are obviously so many reasons why that's a terrible idea. But we will get into the AI of it all with your kids in a month or so. So thank you, Carrie, for saying thing that I guess that AI is a thing. Okay, Laura or Grant, do you have any things to avoid?
I will say I read one theme this year that I saw was kind of going to Gary's point about the authenticity. I read a lot of essays not about the student. I read a lot of great essays about mom. I read a lot of great essays about grandpa. I read a lot of great essays about any other person besides the person applying to the college. So in the same as like writing to your own voice with your students, as much as parents love to be involved, you're also not applying to our schools. So, making sure that it's about the student experience, it's what they're feeling. Yeah, I read a lot where I was like, dang, your grandma sounds awesome. I would love to admit her to DU, but she wasn't applying here. And then I'll kind of jump off the AI question. I also, one common theme is one of the conversations we're having in our office is when to use AI for students. We're kind of along the lines of, it's not great to write your essay, but it is a great spell check. It is a great grammar check. We saw a lot of our students use AI to put in their essays and just ask it to do a simple grammar check for commas and semicolons. And I can tell when a student has definitely put in the thought and effort to the grammar side of things versus, using lowercase I or not using the correct punctuation. Those also can sometimes end up in the trash bin using your words, Ms. Cook. But yeah, those are the two I would say that we've been talking a lot about this year.
Anything to throw in, Ms. Stratton? Okay, great. So I think I'm going to ask the one last question and then open it up for the chat. So do any of you have a parting piece of advice you would give to students and families as they are embarking on the process? Any words of wisdom from all your years?
I can't help but be in the social emotional space with this, so I just have to lean into that. I think as parents and as family members, it is if it's possible to try and not have this take over every conversation you have with your child for the next year. There's so many wonderful things that happen between now and when they go to college, right? Just a really important familial milestones within your school, milestones they need to have with their friends. And so on a panel similar to this, I heard some great advice one time, which is have like one time a week set aside to talk about college. I always think it's best over a meal, and let your child choose the menu, right? So they get to decide, how are we going to talk about this? And then to let them know that it's not going to be what you talk about, like every day on the way to school, or, every waking moment that you're with them is, did you do this? And, all these things, is that opportunity to put this process in its proper place, because at the end of this, you're still going to be a family and they're still going to go to college, right? And just having that trust in the counseling that you're getting, which I would say is such a luxury. I just have to say that as someone who went to public high school where I got no college counseling, the fact that you have this relationship with Ms. Cook is so special. and just to to try and have some guardrails on it and not to have it totally overtake your family life.
Grant or Gary, any advice?
Sure, I'll jump in. I mean, the advice I give when I speak at programs like this is often, very, very similar. It's really two key points that I try to make anytime I speak with families. First is one that I kind of alluded to earlier, and that is, this idea selectivity is not a proxy for quality. Okay, just because a place is highly selective doesn't mean it's inherently amazing, and more specifically, doesn't mean it's the right fit for your student. Because the flip side of that coin is also not true, that because a place is less selective doesn't mean it isn't a great fit or couldn't offer a phenomenal undergraduate education to your students. So don't allow, US News rankings or selectivity or that kind of thing to be the guiding light in this search process. Be open to places that are not highly selective, that can offer, like I said, a really incredible experience for students. And the second is, be wary of kind of the gospel according to the neighbor. I think there are a lot of people who have been through this process and think that they understand it and kind of reverse engineer admission outcomes from previous years. Well, my student applied to UCLA last year and they applied to biology and they were incredible and they got denied. Therefore, biology is a really tough major to get into at UCLA, so you should choose something different. Like, major doesn't play a role in our selection process if students are applying to the College of Letters and Science. So I'm just sharing that as an example. So, I think be careful. You've got a great counselor. You've heard us mention that. There are some very credible sources of information, but there's a lot of profit to be made off of anxiety in this process. A lot of clickbait articles and things that are intended to make you nervous and get you to, consume whatever piece of information that person or entity is trying to push on you. So just be careful of the sources of information that you utilize throughout this process.
Yeah, last thing I would add is just also use us as resources. I think sometimes people have this perception that college admissions folks, sit in conference room and they're reading apps and they're not very social people. Most of us got into this because we were tour guides in college, or we were orientation leaders, or resident assistants, and there is a definitely stereotype of being extroverts, being in this job, because our whole job is to talk to people and kind of help you through this process. So also don't forget to utilize us. One thing about higher ed is that no matter your title, you're always boots on the ground. You're always kind of in the thick of it and willing to help out families. So yeah, please feel free to reach out to us even after today. It's what we get paid to do. We love it.
Excellent. And I will just apologize for the glowing behind me. I'm getting used to the time zone change here with the Zoom in the kitchen. We're making it work. So thank you all. That was really, really excellent advice. And we're now going to move to some things in the chat. Debbie, I think I'm actually going to take your question about where is the line between polish and authenticity, because I am constantly, and Dr. Lessie also helping me review essays, thinking about that. I think to what Grant said about like an ethical use of AI is thinking about grammar and punctuation and making sure that things, make sense and you didn't miss something, in a lowercase or a spell check sort of capacity. But when, we've got, big thesaurus words being used that wouldn't be typically in a 17-year-old's vocabulary. When, I often will tell students, try reading your writing out loud to yourself and see if it sounds like you. Because when it sounds too professorial, too mature, frankly, and I, at this point, after doing this work for 27 years, have a good sense of what a teenage voice sounds like. When we start to get outside of that, that's when I want to just raise the red flag. But it's a balance because each student is different, right? And some are operating in a different level of maturity or social growth or whatnot than others. So I also don't want to sort of dumb it down, for lack of a better word. Laura.
Yeah, just one thing about essays, because we look at them pretty closely, and there are just a few things that I would say. And the first is if the writing quality in the personal essay and the school specific writing is very different, that's usually just like a little bit of a, right? So they're going to work on a personal essay for the Common App, but then usually for most schools, there's school-specific short answer questions, and those come in a lot of different forms. But if a student has this very mature, lyrical, voice in the personal essay, and then the Y Scripps is like, "Hey, girl, I was on your campus. It was so pretty," right? You can tell right, like where is the real student? And more than anything, that's just the question that we ask with that. And then the other thing I would say is that there are different writing opportunities to write on different things. So if they write about going away to summer camp in the personal essay, they're writing again for a college specific writing, don't talk about summer camp again, right? We want to get to know different things about the student if we're learning about them from their own writing. And so that's just something as your student is thinking about things to write about, is just to write on different stuff so we can know them in a more three-dimensional way.
And then Gary, we have a specific question for you since UCLA is test blind. Do you consider AP scores? I think is one piece of the question to answer. And then do you consider AP scores as a proxy?
So yes and no, more no and yes. So I'll start with the first kind of part of this. When we made the decision to go test free, I think there was this perception that we've eliminated one of the two great pillars of college admission, GPA and SAT score. How on earth are we going to make admission decisions without standardized testing? And I think that perception is very real, and I think it's uninformed from the perspective of like people think the test scores mattered more than they actually did, even when we required them. And so there isn't this great void to be filled, So when we made the decision to do that, and you all can look this up, for the University of California, there's something called comprehensive review, which used to be 14 elements that the faculty have approved to say we can consider these things in evaluating an application and making an admission decision. Standardized testing was one of those things. So when that went away, that left us with 13 very credible, supportive, helpful types of information in a college application that allow us to make a very well-informed admission decision about a student's ability to be successful on our campus. And since we've gone test-free, our average first-year GPA at my campus has gone up. Our first to second-year retention has stayed the same and even gone up by 0.5%. So we're not seeing any detrimental impact of the move to test-free. As it relates to AP scores, sharing AP scores in the UC application is completely optional. There is space available if a student has taken an AP exam up through the summer after their junior year, and they want to share those scores, they certainly can. But what I would tell you is we would never look in an application and feel that something is lacking if a student didn't tell us about AP scores. If they took the AP exam and they did well and they want to share that with us, go for it. But if they took an AP class and took the AP exam and didn't really like how they just don't want to report it, they are welcome to not report it, and it's not going to have any detrimental impact on their application. Where AP scores are helpful is if and when the student is admitted and chooses to enroll, then we may grant credit. If a student earned 3 or higher on the exam, that may allow them to earn some credit at UCLA and at the UC system based on how they did on that score. But no, we did not take away SAT and say, okay, now we're going to look at AP scores a little more heavily to kind of fill that void. I think honestly, we feel like there's plenty of other very useful information in the application that we have to make decisions on.
Then we have a broader question about how much should the application include about the major the student is interested in? Does it matter what the major is? And I think, first of all, I'll just say this question is going to vary based on the college that the student is applying to. And so some of this will be some advising conversation I will have with your child. But if each of you could just say something about how much it matters if the student is talking about a major they're interested in, or even have a specific major that they know they're interested in. So Grant, do you want to start?
Yeah, and I would say the one word you all have to get really comfortable with over the next year is it depends. You're gonna hear that a lot from every school, from sometimes every department. With University of Denver, we rarely look at what your students want to study. Coming in undeclared is our second most popular option. Our average freshman changes their major twice. So we do know that likely what they're coming in with is not what they're graduating with. And our average graduate has a major with 2 or 3 minors. So we also know that they're going to come in and likely take classes across the different schools and colleges. So we just want to make sure they're a good fit in the application for our university. Our only exemption to that is going to be our music school. Essentially, you have to prove to us you can play an instrument before we let you study it here. So that one kind of makes sense. But otherwise, we look at what students want to do. We're also direct admission for every program. So that includes business, computer science, engineering. If you get admitted, you're in the program. So kind of some autonomy there for the students to do what they want and change their major if they'd like to. But very transparently, we rarely look at what students want to study because we know they're likely to change it if they come to DU.
I think speaking from the liberal arts college perspective, the qualities that we're looking for aren't specific to major, but are more specific to curiosity. And I would say for Scripps, it's this idea of having multiple interests usually shows alignment with our mission. So we have a number of students who choose to dual major, double major. So if a student's like, I'm interested in chemistry and dance, and I don't know how I'm going to put that together, we're like, yay, right? We don't see that as being indecisive. And so I think, again, it's just the student needs to be authentically themselves in how they talk about academics. But I'd say a good way to think about it from a liberal arts college perspective, should those end up on your students list, is really thinking about curiosity and just an interest in learning broadly about things and learning for learning's sake.
Gary, can you speak for all the UCs?
No, I mean, certainly it depends comes into play here, and the role that major plays in the process can vary from one campus to another. And just for us, as I mentioned, I mean, we have 140 plus majors. Most of those are in the College of Letters and Science, and major doesn't play a role in the admission or selection process there. So there's no need for the student to write about an academic interest per se, unless they really know that there's something distinctive that they are interested in, want to study, and want us to know about that. That's great. But again, the application is not going to be seen as lacking if they don't do that. If students do apply to one of our schools, engineering, theater, film and television, arts and architecture, music, or nursing, then yes, major can play a role in the selection process there. But I think, as you've heard from both Grant and Laura, like we get that a lot of 17 and 18-year-olds don't know what they want to study. And even the ones who think they do are likely to change their mind. So we're not expecting students to, again, have this kind of polished, super developed interest in a particular academic area, unless that's just organically something that they've known that they really want to study for a long time. Great, share it. But if not, don't feel like you're a step behind because, the student doesn't have that level of firm understanding of what they want to study. College is about exploring, not just pursuing what you think you already want to study.
Great, thank you. And the next question, I think, Gary, you would be the one to best speak to. Generally, again, it depends question, but I hear that public universities favor public high school applicants. So are private high school students at a disadvantage, or is this a myth?
I mean, it's a myth. I mean, the short answer is no. We have no targets associated with how many students we take from public schools or independent schools or parochial schools. Like nothing like that exists. I mean, I think the fact of the matter is, just from a sheer volume standpoint, the volume of students applying to the UC system is largely public, from public high schools. So I think that sometimes colors people's perceptions about, our value. I mean, we don't have any commitment or any goals or specific enrollment targets associated with what schools students come from. And I would say to get even a little deeper into that, we don't have any fixed number from particular schools. I think sometimes there's this perception that, there's some cap and we're not going to take more than a certain number of students from a given school. At all of the universities I've ever worked, that's never been a thing. Private, public, large, small, we've never had any kind of limit on the number of students we take from a given high school. We don't have a minimum that we take from a given high school, which means sometimes results can vary, pretty significantly from one year to the next. And it might be impacted by who the students are that are applying, the majors they're applying to. If all your top students are applying to computer science and film at UCLA, that's going to have an impact on some of the admission outcomes, because those are two hyper selective programs on our campus. But short answer to the question, no, there is no preference given to students coming out of public high schools.
Thank you so much. See if my hair can block the sun. Okay, so back to the summer program questions. And I think if I understand this question correctly, Avril, that it's a question about if your campus has a summer program, does that play a role if a student attends a summer program at Scripps? Are they then more likely to be admitted to Scripps? Or does it factor in at all in the conversation about admission decisions? So if any of you have summer programs and can speak to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think every college is going to have different types of summer programs, right? And those have different a different place in our mission. So for Scripps, our summer program is an on-campus summer program for first-generation low-income students of color in Los Angeles and San Bernardino County, right? It's a very specific summer program. And so that the benefit to those students is they just have been on Scripps campus. I think it's a very similar benefit to if you as a family choose to visit a campus, right? When you get to that question of why are you interested in X college, if you've been there and you've met students and you've seen the posters around and the types of events they have, the student is more well-versed in what the college has to offer. So I think that that's the real benefit. But there are other colleges that have residential programs that are revenue generating, right? And those are the opportunity then for that college. So I think it's a good question to ask. I think it's also a fair question more broadly to ask about demonstrated interest, which we've not talked about yet, which is, does a college take into account the number of interactions that a student has prior to and through the admission process, and does that factor into the admission decision? So again, a good question to ask college by college of, do they use demonstrated interest? Scripps does not, but I make absolutely no judgment if a college does, right? This is also a stats game for us in terms of how many students do we need to admit to meet our enrollment goals. And so I think as that's become less predictable for us, which is a nightmare, right? We want predictability. And so I think as that's become less predictable because students are applying to more colleges, that a lot of colleges are using demonstrated interest to hone in on that predictability. So that's more the business side of it. But I do think it's important to remember that should students be using that, should colleges be using that, it's usually for a very specific reason.
All right, maybe that's the last word on that. I think you're correct, Laura. And then I will take the first part of Debbie's question about how do you recommend our students not be swayed by anxiety and the gospel of their friends? If I had a magic answer to that, I could make a lot of money in this field. But I will say that I would always ask your child or you to come to me if you hear something that you feel like is particularly concerning, anxiety provoking, or, to use Gary's phrase, inside baseball, like they found a hack to something. Come double check it with me, because usually I can deflate some of the anxiety, concern, et cetera, with some evidence-based data around things. But I would also just really encourage them to think about how they are going to approach their process and how transparent they are with their friends about it. I do encourage a lot of our students to think about keeping their cards closer to their chest in terms of where they end up applying, or if they apply somewhere early decision or whatnot. Of course, you may want to talk to a very close valued friend or two, but I find that when students broadcast everything they're thinking about and everywhere they're looking, they are then inviting a lot of input on that in every direction. So, and I don't know if our guests have other things to add to that, but then there is a question about the UCs and was it more competitive this year than prior years? And I know we don't have, comprehensive data yet, but.
Yeah, I mean, the general answer to that is admission to UC generally gets more competitive every year. And that's for a couple of reasons. It's applications have generally been increasing, and at some campuses more than others. And I think if you combine that with, and I won't go too deep into this, but like the enrollment funnel essentially ends at how many students are we seeking to enroll? And then the next step up is, what do we anticipate the yield to be, which tells us how many students we think we need to admit to hit that target. So if you're a campus that wants to enroll, and I'm just making these numbers up, these aren't specific to any campus, but if you want to enroll 6,000 students and you anticipate your overall yield is going to be 50%, then you're going to admit 12,000 students. So that's the numerator in the fraction, and the denominator is how many students applied. But if yield has been going up and this year you anticipate yield's going to be higher, and I think that yield's going to be more like, 60%, then you're going to admit 10,000 students. Same enrollment target, but you think yield might be higher, and so you're admitting fewer to make sure you hit that target without going over. So sometimes there can be numbers going in different directions for reasons that, you know, the volume of applications is outside of our control. The yield is something that generally is outside of our control. I mean, we're happy to see more students saying yes to us, but those things can impact selectivity in a given year. And I'll quickly just address one other question very quickly around kind of impacted majors. I've been at UCLA, you know, going on 13 years now. It's a term that I still can't stand, and impacted majors. But there, for us, you know, you're talking things in engineering. You know, you're talking nursing. You know, there was an article I think written recently around nursing. We have, in an incoming class of about 6,600 students this year, we'll enroll about 35 or 40 in nursing. About 6,000 students applied for that. So it's less than a 1% admit rate. So, you know, engineering, nursing, some of the talent-based majors, film, things like that can be a little more competitive. But to be honest, I don't want students to get too fixated on that question, because with last year we had a 9% admit rate. You know, there isn't any major where it's like, hey, you know, apply to that and, you know, easy, you know, you're on easy street. Like it just doesn't work like that in our process, and major doesn't play a role outside of those exceptions that I mentioned a little bit earlier.
Yes, and there was something else I was going to say about impacted majors. Oh, yeah, I mean, I do think across the board, generally nationally, we've got a computer science and engineering, and then sometimes computer science engineering can be some of the most competitive routes, but it does vary by school. And some years the UC, at the UC conference that I go to in the fall, has printed a list of some of the really big, most competitive places by campus that I then can share with families. But these things do vary. And we still want you to be earnest with what you're interested in, and not try and game the system in that way. I will say for JCHS overall, and I will name that it's 9 o'clock, so we're going to get close to wrapping up here. But I will say for JCHS overall, we have heard from all of the UCs at this point, save for Cal. Gary, does that seem right? Is Cal the only one that has an interview? Yeah, okay. And we have had admitted students at all of the campuses. I don't see a big difference right now in JCHS success from past years. But the caveat there is, again, there are these small admit rates on some of the campuses, right? And so there may be a list of students that applied, and the corollary percentage got in from JC, which may be 1 or 2 students. So the odds are not always ever in your favor. But as we look at your list, we'll want to make sure that we're making some well-rounded choices. So if that UC option you're really excited about that's highly selective works out, terrific. But if it doesn't, that we've got lots of other choices too. Okay, with that, I think we're going to wrap up here, 9:01 a.m. I really want to thank Laura and Gary and Grant for being with us this morning. Always helpful to hear your perspectives. And for parents in the room, thank you as always for participating. We'll send a recording out later in the week, and please be in touch if there are lingering questions from anything that came up, and we'll try and get you some answers. So yeah, thank you all. Have a good week. Good luck to all of our campus-based friends on yielding your admitted students.
Thanks so much.
Thank
All right, take care.
you.
Thank you all.